Germany in the spring of 1945. American troops were gradually conquering the Third Reich. U.S. Army cameramen were at the forefront of the fighting as the GIs advanced further into the country, despite the fierce resistance of the Germans.
Thousands of German soldiers were still dying for Hitler's vision of world domination. After 12 years of Nazi rule, the country now lay in ruins. The cameraman also filmed the liberation of the victims of this war. The pictures of German atrocities went round the world.
The U.S. 7th Armored Division was advancing in the Westerwald. After crossing the Rhine 2 weeks before, the American troops conquered village after village in the area. Time and again they encountered German units determined to hold out. Air Force and artillery would destroy every house and every village in which resistance stirred. There was little the defenders could do to defy the enemy's superiority. In the small village of Borden, only the Russian forced laborers were visibly happy about being liberated. "1,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were captured and herded together in neighboring Moit. They had been unable to obey their Führer's order of the 11th of March that commanded them to offer resistance and fight our enemies for as long as it takes, until they tire and finally break." The civilian population looked after the prisoners of war as well as they could. After 2 days on the muddy field, they were taken to an assembly camp. The U.S. 5th Infantry Division marched on Hitler's Autobahn towards Frankfurt am Main on that day, where they first captured the nearby Rhine-Main airport. On the previous day, American units had reached Frankfurt city centre. The Remagen Bridge was only partially damaged due to a hasty detonation by the retreating Germans, so the troops under Major General Robert W. Groh established a bridgehead on its north side, where they became engaged in combat with German units. An army cameraman filmed the house-to-house fighting. The German commander, Lieutenant Colonel Löffler, was determined to defend the city. "If we knew that there was no support behind us," he explained to his soldiers, "we ought to hoist the white flag and end this battle. But perhaps our leaders have another trump card up their sleeve. Should that be the case, then we must not face the accusation that our or my failure has prevented them from playing it. So we will do what we have to do." On the afternoon of the following day, American artillery shells would hit the command post of the Germans. Löffler was seriously wounded and succumbed to his injuries. His unit was no longer fit for action. The war in Frankfurt am Main was over. Units of the U.S. 87th Infantry Division advanced south of the Lahn River. In the Westerwald, a young woman noted in her diary, "Suddenly someone shouted, 'The Americans are coming!' At 11 in the morning, the first American jeeps drove into our village. The village surrendered.
Some 200 German soldiers had assembled in the village and were taken prisoner. The houses were searched hastily. My cousin has 40 soldiers billeted with her. No one could have known it would happen so fast. The feeling that we are now American is indescribable, but also incomprehensible at the moment.
A U.S. Army cameraman accompanied an armored unit on the way to Wetzlar. The war had arrived in the geographical center of Germany. After their retreat, some Wehrmacht and SS units had barricaded themselves here on the other side of the Lahn River. German snipers put up a final fight. Men in civilian clothes ended the senseless fighting when they hastily hung a white flag from a tree branch. Wetzlar capitulated too. Liberated slave laborers celebrated the end of Hitler's reign of terror. The American divisions were making an almost unhindered advance toward the north and the east of Germany. On that day, 29th of March 1945, their lines pushed forward up to 100 kilometers.
Just outside Wetzlar, the GIs came across an area fenced off with barbed wire. Here, the Nazis had set up a transit camp for Allied prisoners of war. Crews of shot-down bombers were transported here to be interrogated. Some 90,000 American airmen had been captured in the entire Reich. Those who were fortunate enough to come under Luftwaffe custody were safe, for many pilots whose planes had gone down had been lynched by angry mobs. According to prisoner reports, the food rations in the Dulag Luft camp were sufficient. The Red Cross kept sending food parcels.
The German guards did not always treat the Allied prisoners as cordially as the images from Wetzlar suggest. Even the smallest violations of camp regulations were punished harshly. Now the guards became the prisoners. Dulag Luft was evacuated on the same day. The liberated pilots were free to return home. Every obstacle blocking the advance of the troops was immediately cleared by the Sherman tanks.
Still, German units were often forced by their commanders to offer resistance to the superiority of the U.S. Army. Those soldiers who wanted to back away from the bloodbath faced on-the-spot execution.
The Commander-in-Chief South, General Otto Wöhler, had handed out unambiguous instructions to his soldiers on the previous day. I've noticed again that an intolerable number of stragglers have been roaming in the areas of retreat. Stragglers are in most cases cowards and shirkers, and thus war criminals. They do not deserve our pity because they let their comrades bear the weight of the battle alone. Those who become separated from their units during battle are to report immediately to the next fighting unit. Finding it is not difficult. The noise of the battle is the safest sign to follow.
American soldiers during the Easter service in the occupied town of Limburg on the Lahn River. A Catholic chaplain reads the Holy Mass, with the bonnet of a military vehicle serving as the altar. Cameraman Butterfield captured the brief contemplative ceremony. In nearby Westerwald, a young woman noted, "The feeling that we are now under American command is beyond description. Today is Easter Sunday. It was a beautiful and moving resurrection ceremony this morning. We could heave a sigh of relief and sing our hallelujahs. The shackles have finally fallen from us. We're free now." And she added, "This time they will drive militarism and National Socialism out of our midst, and they will be thorough. Not one iota of what was our world until now will be left standing."
A German soldier wrote to his family on that 1st of April, "This is one of the saddest Easters in history for us Germans. The enemy has penetrated deep into our country, both in the east and the west. Yet the war will only be lost when we give ourselves up. Providence has sent us the Führer, and it will not let all the terrible sacrifices we have made be in vain."
The U.S. 6th Armored Division continued to advance into Thuringia. Army cameraman Sawyer filmed their onslaught near the town of Mulhausen. What the people here couldn't know was that the Americans would only stay for a few months. As of the 1st of July 1945, Thuringia became part of the Soviet-occupied zone.
A German sergeant wrote in his diary, "The political press and radio coverage endeavours to convince us that the relations between the USA and Britain on the one hand and the USSR on the other are heading for an imminent crisis. They want to create the impression that it's just a matter of days before the differences between them come to a head and an incurable breach is created." And he continued, "It's obvious that the existing differences are shamelessly and calculatedly exploited these days. An appeal recently issued by the head of the party Chancellery Bormann to all Gauleiters, district administrators and other organization leaders demands them to stand or fall. It seems to me that the emphasis is clearly on the latter."
The American army commanders were in disagreement about the strategy to be followed. Some were determined to reach Berlin before the Red Army. However, US Commander-in-Chief Eisenhower believed that this move could cost the lives of another 100,000 US soldiers. Over 10,000 GIs had fallen in March alone. Eisenhower finally directed the bulk of his army towards the south, wanting to destroy the feared Alpine fortress, which would soon prove to be an illusion.
Units of the US 14th Armored Division reached the town of Gmundon at the confluence of the Saale and Main rivers. The GIs crossed the Saale on assault boats. Army cameraman Walter Resembel was with them at the forefront. Gmundon lay exactly on the supply line of the Germans for the contested front at the Main River. so the town was defended by strong forces which had to be quelled in a bloody house-to-house fight. Many German and American soldiers lost their lives here. The cameramen were not allowed to film dead GIs.
The Americans had taken control of the center of Gmundon on the previous evening. The German defending forces had left the town. Still, the US soldiers searched every single building for snipers. At first, they found the few remaining town inhabitants. They'd been hiding in air raid shelters and bunkers for weeks. Then, eventually, the last defending soldiers surrendered too.
The Air Force had run several air raids on Gmundon in order to break the German resistance. Now the supplies rolled again through the burning town. A group of GIs tried to save from the flames what remained of the historic old part of town. But the centuries-old half-timbered houses burnt like tinder.
Those who survived had to recover the bodies of the dead and were able to salvage some of their belongings from the ruins. A citizen of Gmundon later recollected how he felt on the day the town was taken by the Americans. We were naturally relieved, but it was difficult to get accustomed to the idea that these terrible events had suddenly come to an end.
Once the through roads had been cleared of debris, an armoured unit was sent to a special operation upon orders from the highest command. Just a few kilometers outside of Gmundon was the Hammelburg prison camp. U.S. Army Commander General George S. Patton had a special interest in it. He believed that a relative of his was among the 4,000 prisoners of war.
Left in the camp were a mere 75 American soldiers. The rest of them had been taken away after a U.S. Army unit on a special mission had reached Hammelburg 10 days before and was annihilated by the Germans. Most of the prisoners who were now liberated were Yugoslavs. At the end, the GIs managed to find the person they were searching for, General Patton's son-in-law, Colonel John Waters.
At the northern front, the U.S. First Army, under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, fought its way toward the Roer, following an established course of action. Any resistance was broken from the air before the ground troops would engage. These are images from Schmallenberg in the Sauerland region.
Only about 40 kilometers away, 320,000 German soldiers, more than in Stalingrad, had been surrounded on all sides in the Ruhr for 1 week. Here in Schmallenberg, only a handful of privates were captured on that 8th of April.
Further northeast, soldiers of the U.S. 83rd Infantry Division reached the Holzen concentration camp. Just a few prisoners were left in it. Hundreds of them had been taken away on death marches only days before. Cameraman Gira captured the first images of the victims of the Nazi regime since the U.S. Army had begun its advance in the West. And they wouldn't be the last.
Holzen had been built as an outcamp of the Buchenwald concentration camp. The Russian, Polish and Jewish prisoners had to mine bitumen in a nearby pit under inhuman conditions. The tunnels were to be converted to a bomb-proof manufacturing plant for the armaments industry. The factory was never put into operation.
U.S. troops continued their advance in Thuringia toward the Elbe River. U.S. Army cameramen embedded in the units filmed the war in Germany. But the Third Reich refused to capitulate. Every village and every city had to be defended and held by all means, demanded the Reichsführer of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. However, those determined to hold out could do little against the military superiority of the Allies.
On that day, the 10th of April 1945, the GIs arrested the first major figure of Nazi Germany, the former Deputy Chancellor Franz von Papen. He had helped Hitler to come to power in 1933 and had fallen in disgrace later. Recently, he had lived with his family under house arrest in the Westphalian town of Werl. During the cross-examination with Major General Harry Twaddle, the Nazi politician questioned the validity of his arrest. He argued that he had never held a military position and was over 65 years of age. Half a year later, von Papen was placed on trial in Nuremberg and was released on appeal in 1949.
White flags have been fluttering in the wind since 6 o'clock in the morning in the northern Bavarian city of Coburg as an indication of the population's eagerness to surrender. American units had taken positions just outside the city for nearly 24 hours. Whether there really was another battle with German snipers, or whether the U.S. Army cameramen had these scenes reenacted, is unclear. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the city's senior civil servant, Sauerteig, signed the capitulation. Fighting came to an end.
Proclamation number 1 was issued by U.S. Commander-in-Chief Eisenhower and posted in the city center. We come as a victorious army, but not as oppressors. In the German territory which is occupied by the armed forces under my supreme command, we will eliminate National Socialism and German militarism, abolish the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and do away with the cruel and unjust laws and institutions established by the NSDAP.
When the soldiers of the U.S. 104th Infantry Division captured the city of Nordhausen near the Harz Mountains on that 11th of April, they weren't yet aware of how close they were to uncovering the dreadful truth about the atrocities committed by the Germans. In the ruins of Nordhausen, soldiers of the renowned Timberwolf Division took a break from fighting. For the time being, they were in the mood for jokes with some Polish girls, liberated slave laborers.
On that same day, American soldiers on the southern outskirts of the city reached the ruins of the Bulge barracks, which had been heavily damaged during a British air raid. The GIs found several hundred emaciated concentration camp prisoners and slave laborers from the Mittelbau-Dora camp who had been toiling in the tunnels of nearby Kornstein for Hitler's miracle weapons. The sick and the weak were brought to the Bulge barracks to die. The SS guards had run away after the air raid and abandoned the prisoners to their fate. The liberators found over 2,000 decaying bodies.
The U.S. Army immediately set up a military hospital in the direct vicinity and requested additional medical units to relieve the suffering prisoners. There are no words to describe that stench, one of the GIs said later. Many of our guys were tough and were battle-hardened after they had landed in Normandy. But that experience shocked us to the core and made everyone physically sick. For many of the prisoners, help arrived too late. They died from hunger and exhaustion.
On the following day, citizens of Nordhausen were ordered by the Americans to lay out the bodies of the victims. The images from Nordhausen, captured by the U.S. Army cameramen, were seen around the world. They became symbols of the Nazi regime of horror. For many GIs, the war now reached a new level.
One of them remembered at a later point, "Most of us had nothing personal against the Germans. We thought that many of the stories we'd read in newspapers or heard were fabrications, or at least exaggerated." What the war was actually about only became clear when we entered Nordhausen.
South of Jena, tanks and soldiers of the U.S. 89th Infantry Division pushed forward on that day. Cameraman Caliendo filmed some remarkable scenes here. American journalist Martha Gellhorn was in the occupied part of Germany as a war correspondent during those days. She reported on the rapid adaptability of the Germans. No one is a Nazi. No one has ever been one. Maybe there were a few Nazis in the next village. And yes, the city 20 kilometers away was a real hotbed of National Socialism. We were fed up with this government, they say, and we welcome the Americans. We have no reason to be frightened. We have done nothing wrong. We are not Nazis.
In most places, the spell of the dictator was gradually broken. More and more Germans now openly showed their delight about the arrival of the Americans. Women from Drosendorf gave the GIs eggs. The Task Force R of the U.S. 104th Infantry Division reached the outskirts of Halle on that 14th of April. The advance of the Timberwolf Division was halted when German soldiers opened fire. After a brief engagement by Sherman tanks, the road was clear again. The Germans surrendered. In order to prevent another senseless massacre, as well as the destruction of their city, Halle citizens under the leadership of the legendary Count Felix Luckner went out to meet the Americans with white flags and ensured that Halle was not shelled. The local SS commander had yelled after them, "This will cost you your heads." The entry into Halle occurred without any major incidents after the agreement, so the GIs of Task Force K had time to pose one more time for Cameraman Miller. The Americans took total control of Halle on the following day. Whether such skirmishes actually took place in the city remains unclear.
The Thuringian city of Gira capitulated on that 14th of April. Soldiers of the German 7th Army were taken prisoner. Some people took advantage of the chaotic conditions and looted provisions. A young woman wrote on that day, "A revolting fight over provisions set in immediately. The city is like Babylon, a mixture of strange characters, among whom the Germans are not the best. It seems that peace and quiet will never return. What helps is this daily writing. One can withdraw into it and oppose the absurdity of these weeks with the small, everyday things of life."
On that same day, U.S. Army cameraman Downard shot the first footage of Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar. Most of the SS guards had fled 3 days before. The prisoners had overcome the remaining thugs and handed the camp over to the advancing U.S. units.
The GIs were shocked by the conditions in the enormous camp complex. The 21,000 prisoners had had no bread for 3 days. At least 5,000 of the survivors were in a critical condition, and every day over 200 prisoners were dying from malnutrition and typhoid fever. The notes of the camp doctor revealed that in the 8-year-old history of Buchenwald, 32,705 prisoners had died, not counting those who had been executed.
The next day, U.S. correspondent Edward R. Murrow would report on the radio, "As I walked along the prisoners' blocks, the men who were too weak to stand began to applaud. It sounded as if it were babies trying to clap their hands. That's how weak they were. I can't find words to describe what I saw. There are many fatalities in a war, but these men in the camp were living dead. In contrast, the Germans were well fed and well dressed.
U.S. Army Commander George S. Patton ordered 1,000 citizens of Weimar to visit Buchenwald camp. On the 10-kilometer-long walk up to the Ettersberg, many of them seemed unaware of what lay in store for them. The guided tour across the camp had been meticulously organized by the Americans.
First, the citizens of Weimar were presented with evidence of the barbarity: shrunken heads and tattooed pieces of skin, skillfully prepared souvenirs from an SS production plant. Then they were taken to the crematorium, where the corpses had been piled up. A prisoner described the people's reactions in a letter to his sister. What they saw were just humble remains of the reality we had experienced. But it was enough for some people to faint. "We didn't know," they cried out desperately. All of a sudden, and after years of regarding and treating us as criminals, they were faced with the certainty of an indelible guilt.
In a written report, U.S. General Eric F. Wood questioned the educational effects of this action. After the inspection, many citizens had the impudence to claim that they had never heard of this camp, although it was in their direct vicinity. "50,000 German soldiers were herded together in the Miesenheim prisoner of war camp near Andernach. Thousands more were brought in every day, as entire Wehrmacht units laid down their arms and were transported to the meadows on the banks of the Rhine. Cameraman Owens was there and filmed Hitler's boy soldiers. At the beginning of April, the Führer had had the 1928 to 29 age group drafted. Many 16-year-old boys lost their lives for the collapsing Third Reich. The unusually hot spring sun and insufficient water supplies took their toll on the prisoners. On the previous day, the Allied expedition forces had issued a preliminary assessment of the situation. From all viewpoints, it's only a matter of time before organized resistance in Nazi Germany will break down completely. Nothing is now able to rectify the errors made by Hitler and his officials any longer in trying to prolong the war or to turn the situation in their favor. The abilities of the enemy are indeed zero." Many of the prisoners of war were taken to Namur in Belgium in freight wagons. They were the fortunate ones. In the months to follow, thousands of German soldiers would die on the Rhine meadows due to supply problems.
The American troops had reached Leipzig, where they encountered a remarkable willingness to surrender from the population. Members of the local resistance had been distributing leaflets for days, with mottos such as "End the senseless war of the Nazis" and "Start waving the white flags." The people were told to comply absolutely with the instructions of the occupying authorities.
Nevertheless, there were fanatics here too. A 16-year-old boy from the Hitler Youth managed to knock out a Sherman tank with a bazooka. Its crew died, and the boy was killed by the next tank.
Soldiers of the U.S. 69th Infantry Division combed through the railway station in Leipzig on that 19th of April. The German forces defending it had surrendered on the previous evening, yet there could still be individual fighters hiding in one of the largest railway stations in Europe. Army cameraman Smith captured these scenes. Fighting was still going on in parts of the city. After the German military governor, Colonel von Ponsert, was forced to abandon the railway station and the town hall to the Americans, he barricaded himself with 300 followers in the Battle of the Nations monument on the outskirts of the city.
Liberated French prisoners of war were cheering when Major General von Ziegler was taken prisoner by the Americans. He had been removed from his post as the military governor of Leipzig just a few days before his arrest due to his hesitant attitude.
The occupation troops appealed to the population over a PA system to remain calm. By 2 in the morning, the entire city would be in the hands of the Americans.
In Leipzig's town hall, the US soldiers made a gruesome discovery. The city's mayor Freiberg had committed suicide together with his wife and daughter. His deputy, the city treasurer Dr. Lissow, had followed his fate. And also the head of the local NSDAP, Albert Wiederoth, had put an end to his life on the Führer's 56th birthday.
Yet this discovery was insignificant compared with the frightful scenes the US soldiers faced in the Leipzig suburb of Tekla. The rubble of a shack in the forced labor camp was smoldering. Horribly mutilated corpses lay everywhere. Evidently, the German security guards had driven over 300 prisoners into the shack, poured petrol over it, and then set it alight before they ran off. Those who managed to escape the flames were killed by the bullets of the retreating guards. The U.S. Army cameraman captured every detail. These images would be used as evidence later in trials against the German war criminals.
On the same day, tanks of the U.S. 7th Army reached the center of Nuremberg. Hitler personally had ordered that the city of the Nazi Party rallies be defended to the last man standing. Local Gauleiter Karl Holz was a fanatical follower of the Führer and was determined to fulfill his wish. So the Defense Commissioner of Nuremberg personally led raiding patrols against the American tanks. The US troops advanced cautiously as small German units kept engaging them in skirmishes. Gauleiter Holz was later found dead in a cellar.
Nuremberg's historic old town was a heap of ruins. 90% of all buildings have been destroyed. It's unclear how many German soldiers lost their lives for their Führer on the day of his birthday. The Americans also suffered losses. On the previous evening, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had held his last radio address in Berlin. The hour has come when we must prove ourselves. Of course, I will stay in Berlin with my assistants. My wife and children are here and will stay here too. our fight will be the signal for the most purposeful fight of the entire nation.
The burning town of Crailsheim, east of Schwäbisch Hall, was captured by the Americans for the second time on the 21st of April. 10 days prior to that, the 13th SS Corps had succeeded in retaking it. The few hundred remaining inhabitants didn't seem too impressed by the return of the German forces. A local teacher wrote in her diary, "None of the people standing on the side of the road are happy about our compatriots, or about the fact that we're German again. They're thinking they'll trigger off Allied air raids again, and I wish it was over." Fascinated, the U.S. Army cameraman filmed this scene with the 82-year-old Catherine Marie Koppenhofer wandering alone among the ruins of Crailsheim.
According to the plan of U.S. Army Commander George S. Patton, the final act was to begin in the Swabian town of Dillingen on that day. The crossing of the 7th Army over the Danube. The U.S. 12th Armored Division encountered resistance. The German Commander-in-Chief, West Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, was determined to halt the enemy's advance here. He informed General Ritter von Epp, who was willing to capitulate, that he, Kesselring, had the better overview, and that he also had orders to obey. 3 days later, however, the Danube would no longer present an obstacle to the Americans.
Adolf Hitler had a nervous breakdown in the bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin on that 22nd of April. The Führer told his shocked generals that the war was lost and that he would commit suicide. From that moment on, coherent conduct of the war by the Wehrmacht no longer existed.
The bridge over the Danube fell into the hands of the Allies intact. The GIs removed several 500-pound bombs, which would have destroyed the bridge had they been detonated. The Americans established the bridgehead on the other side.
In Kitzingen near Würzburg, SS man Richard Jaworczyk was led to his execution at dawn. The town had been in American hands for 2 weeks now. Jaworczyk had tried to get to a bridge over the Main in civilian clothes with the intention of blowing it up. He was summarily court-martialed as a spy and put before a firing squad. A military doctor confirmed his death.
In Grimma, east of Leipzig, Army cameraman Hutton filmed soldiers and civilians crossing the small Mulde River on that 23rd of April. The no man's land between the Elbe and Mulde rivers was crowded with former slave laborers, liberated Allied POWs, and citizens who had fled from besieged towns. Many Wehrmacht soldiers had obviously run away to avoid the approaching Soviets. They thought it better to be taken prisoner by the Americans. Among these were also soldiers from General Vlasov's Cossack army. They had gone to war on the side of Hitler and were now dreading Stalin's revenge. The Red Army had reached the Elbe River, barely 40 kilometers away.
Downstream, in the town of Dannenberg in Lower Saxony, soldiers of the U.S. 5th Armored Division discovered some mysterious production sheds in a remote forest. A special model of the V-1 missile had been built here. In actual fact, Hitler's miracle weapon was unmanned and had been primarily used against cities in the south of England since the summer of 1944. The technicians here had obviously been converting them to be used for kamikaze attacks by fearless pilots. They would steer the otherwise rather inaccurate V-1s into undamaged bridges or advancing enemy units. The curious GIs inspected the peculiar structure, which was never used for its intended purpose.
U.S. Major General Emil F. Reinhardt crossed the Elbe in a Russian rowboat to take part in an historic event. A meeting of the American and the Soviet armed forces was staged near Torgau as a symbol of the victory against Nazi Germany. Soviet cameramen were also present in order to film Reinhardt's meeting with Major General Vladimir Rusakov. However, American reporters had been faster. On the previous day, a small American reconnaissance patrol had run into Red Army soldiers. The encounter was captured on film.
US President Harry Truman, who had taken over office from Franklin D. Roosevelt after the latter's death on the 12th of April, would solemnly declare on the following day, "The meeting of our forces in the heart of Germany is of great significance for the entire world. The last desperate hopes of Hitler and his gangster administration have now been obliterated." Also in that speech, Truman expressed a wish that seemed unrealistic even at the time it was voiced. Secondly, the alliance of our armed forces is a signal to us and the entire world that the cooperation between our nations for the cause of peace and freedom is an effective cooperation which can withstand the gravest difficulties of the most enormous campaign in military history and end in success.
4 days before Hitler committed suicide, and 12 days before the unconditional capitulation of Nazi Germany, the post-war era had begun on the stage of world politics.